hello to everyone wherever you may be today. Just by way of context, it's May the 5th, 2020. It's 5 months since the COVID-19 outbreak has been known, and we hope we're reaching a tipping point of sorts. There are signs that we've reached peaks of new infections in some places around the world now. Much of Asia is back at work, albeit tentatively. China is reporting 95% of its large businesses have since reopened, including all its major supply chains. Parts of Europe and North America are returning to work too, carefully, cautiously. Now, throughout the pandemic, timely and reliable news and information has been of paramount importance. And so today I'm delighted to introduce our panel of journalists, editors and columnists to hear firsthand about their experiences, how they've been reporting it. I will ask them to introduce themselves, just saying briefly, where they work, what their remit is, and also one thing they've learned, could be anything, about the crisis. So just to put names to voices, let's start off, please. Aria from a Business Insider. Aria, please introduce yourself.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everyone. I'm Aria Bendix. I'm a senior reporter at Business Insider. I've been covering the coronavirus since the very start. I think I was the first reporter that they actually put on the story. So this has been, a 3-4 month, journey for me. I've obviously learned a lot along the way. I actually was a patient myself. So going along with a lot of the COVID-19 symptoms as I was speaking to patients. So I think my big takeaway has been just learning the importance of actually speaking to people who are dealing with this on a very visceral level, talking to patients constantly, learning their questions, and then reflecting that in my own writing and reporting.
That's great. Thank you, Aria. And we should say you're based in South Korea. Is that correct?
I'm actually in New York City. So I'm in the US epicenter.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, Laura from the BBC, who obviously I was thinking of you, Laura. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Laura Bicker. I'm the BBC Seoul correspondent. I've been here for nearly 3 years, but obviously in January, Seoul and certainly the rest of South Korea was hit by its first case on January the 20th. Here, a few months on, they have crushed the curve. We had 0 locally transmitted cases today for the second day in a row. One of the things I've learned is, as you've heard, it's important to talk to those not just who are dealing with the virus, but those who are treating the virus. And here it has become really important to figure out exactly how they've managed to isolate, test, and trace this virus and get it under control.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. Loads of insights there I'm sure we can get to. Adrian Carter from New York Times, please.
Hi, I'm Adrian Carter. I'm the Asia editor for the New York Times, based here in Hong Kong. I moved here about 7 months ago, just in time for kind of the violence of the protests reaching a height, and I thought that was crazy enough. And now, obviously, we've been dealing with this since late December and into January. And now have obviously dealt with the expulsion of our reporters from mainland China. So it's definitely been a whirlwind of 7 months. I think in terms of COVID, what we've learned is to expect the unexpected. Everything we think is true, whether it's, old people tend to get it, is always countered by a different narrative. Younger people tend to get it unexpectedly and die very quickly. And everything sort of changes from moment to moment. And sort of that's been quite the learning experience, just to try to understand what is this disease, where is it headed, and why is it affecting some places and some people differently as you go around.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Adrian. Okay. Mindy from Quick Take Bloomberg.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mindy Masucci. I am the global editor of Quick Take by Bloomberg. I'm based in New York. And, one of the things that I think that this team, we are a global team, we're based in New York, Hong Kong, and London. And one of the things that I've learned while we have continued to cover this story is to look for the rays of hope. And look for them in the most mundane things. This can be an extremely draining story to cover. It can also be, obviously it's an extremely difficult story for people to be able to live with on a daily basis. So to be able to find those moments where you can give people inspiration and hope, no matter how mundane that might be in the tiniest little things, it's become more and more important to us as journalists, and we are just finding that people are very responsive to it as consumers.
That's great. Thank you, Mindy. Now, Alan Smith, who's you work in data visualization for the FT, Alan, so a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, that's right. Hello, everybody. My name is Alan Smith, and I'm head of visual and data journalism at the FT. And I guess sort of an early takeaway for us is that imperfect, uncertain data has never been more valuable. That trying to make sense of that for us has been more about just writing individual stories. It's been about building actually kind of news products out of those data sets that allow us to keep a track of what's happened since January. So the takeaway for us really is the fact that things that maybe we'd been saying 2 or 3 years ago about the importance of data and analysis to the news agenda has been brought to bear in this story. And it's almost impossible to try and make sense of it without using data that, like I say, it's not perfect. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, but there's no doubt that the path ahead lies somewhere in the analysis of that data.
Yeah, really interesting, Alan. Thank you. That the value of imperfect data, and especially when we don't have a complete picture, which we never have had about the coronavirus. So I think that'll be really interesting to dig into. And lastly, Ishan from Washington Post, please.
Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'm Ishan Tharoor. I'm at the Washington Post here in DC, where I'm a columnist on the foreign desk. In the newsroom, I anchor, and I'm the lead author for today's World View, which is the Post's column and international newsletter on global politics. And in my capacity as this sort of global commentator, it's been a fascinating moment to sort of see how my audience is experiencing this pandemic. Obviously, so much of the coverage is anchored around national conversations, national lockdowns and quarantines in the US city and state level hotspots and crises. It's my remit to kind of stitch it all together into a more global story, and sort of craft and in many ways try to hold up examples elsewhere in the world to the US American conversation. And that's what I do on a daily basis. That's what I did on a daily basis before the pandemic. And I find that having that global perspective has, for my audience, been very worthwhile during the pandemic.
That's great, Ishan. Thank you. And I wonder if we just start with how much information has been available since the pandemic has been recognized. How do you guys even begin on determining what you focus on first and how you cover it? And it's a very open-ended question. Aria, would you like to start?
Sure. So our model at Insider has always been to rely on data to determine, the focus of our stories. So I think we're staying closely attuned to, where readers are clicking, what they're interested in, also opening up a general dialogue with people on Twitter and via email to see what readers are interested in and following their lead. I think we have a nice synergy with the community that tends to follow Business Insider and Insider. And interests change constantly, but we found that there's an unending stream of interest in the virus in general, and that hasn't died down over the past 3 or 4 months. There's obviously a greater need, I think now more than ever, for service journalism. So on the most basic level, people are really concerned about knowing, can I go outside? Can I exercise? How do I clean my home? There's really, really simple questions that actually don't have simple answers in this time. And I think that's our mission, is to satisfy, that information first and foremost.
Yeah, thank you. You talk about service journalism. Alan, maybe I'll bring you in now. I know you guys have actually made a lot of content about the pandemic available beyond your paywall. Maybe just tell us a bit about what you've been doing.
Yeah, so I mean, just generally, we've made a large amount of FT content free to read as part of our coronavirus coverage, which we think is really important because people do need to keep up to date, and not just up to date on individual stories, but places that they can keep coming back to for sort of, because this is a story that's changing so frequently, and what looked like a story heading in a certain direction in January is very different by the time we get to March or April. I mean, for us, just in terms of the sort of, like I say, the sort of news products we've been making, the really interesting thing for us is obviously you've got to be geared by where the story's going and also what information is available, which has changed enormously throughout the life of this story. Even in terms of the sort of visual and data journalism that we've been covering, you've got this remarkable arc through, the initial interest in cases, then the interest in deaths, and now this interest in excess deaths, and then this interest in the sort of stringency of government lockdowns and how quickly you can relax those controls. That's an enormous amount of data, and to work out how to make that valuable to just literally everybody who's been affected by this crisis. It's a real big challenge for journalism in a global context.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually this has been numbers led, hasn't it? But since the beginning, people have been talking about all these different data points, and actually data viz, I think, has come into its own during this coverage. Adrienne, I don't know what thoughts you have in Hong Kong, especially when, like you say, some US outlets, like including your own, have now been excluded from mainland China.
Yeah, I mean, for us in the beginning, it was doing what we always did. You run to where the crisis is. And when we heard that we had been in Wuhan since middle of January, and the moment we heard there was a lockdown coming on January 23rd, one of our reporters got on the train that day, got in before the lockout, and spent the next 76 days in Wuhan. And then obviously, as that was coming to, and everything's been coming to an end, they were all expelled. So many of them were expelled. And so for us, it's sort of trying to get creative. I mean, I think what the pandemic taught us is you can do a lot of things very creatively. We're used to, as journalists, is running into the fire, running into the disaster, and you can't do that now. You have to be a lot more cautious and a lot more thoughtful. And so in terms of our coverage going forward, it's really about, thinking about document work, using social media to talk to people, using the various resources, figuring out where China is elsewhere and trying to understand that. So, the pandemic taught us a lot about how to do that creatively, and we're just going to have to kind of keep doing that.
Yeah, thank you. And Laura, how about for you?
I think the interesting thing for me is how the interest in this has come in waves. Now, the BBC as a brand, people have come to the website in their millions. I mean, I think the 40 million in the first couple of weeks in April were getting daily hits. They have these kind of videos that will give you the kind of quick rundown, what a lockdown is, what social distancing means, all of these things. That's the kind of information that people needed. But from my point of view, you talk about running into the fire. That's exactly what I did. So we had the hotspot of Daegu here in South Korea. We ran into the fire, and that was in February. But the kind of decision making that I'm having to make for me and my team is, how close can we get? Can I go into that hospital? Should I go into this hospital? What does the reader, what does the listener, what does the viewer need to see? What do I need to let them know about what's happening here in South Korea and what could happen to them? And the decision that we made was, yes, we are going in that hospital. We will stay away from the doctor. We'll wear masks. We'll talk to the doctor about the kind of decision making he's going through, to try to perhaps give people an insight into what might be coming their way. I think what's happened then is South Korea has peaked, and then of course we've had that downward trend in the curve, just as Italy, Europe, the United States have had their big hits. So just as I thought the story was coming to an end here, it was becoming huge way over in the West. But that didn't mean that there wasn't interest, because, well, hang on a second, how are you handling it over there? The huge interest in how South Korea has done this has taken me by surprise. The huge interest within this country about how the BBC is handling it. BBC has its own Korean service here. We were well known. I've interviewed the president. I was relatively well known. Now, everything I say is translated, retweeted. They are desperate for information from a trusted source. And these are the kind of things that have blown me away. But the interest in South Korea's story outside of here also has really piqued my interest, because even within the last few hours, they've launched this app in the UK, contact tracing. They want to know how contact tracing works here. They want to hear the experiences. So that's the kind of thing that I've been able to show them. And that does mean running into fire. It has meant quarantine. It has meant really big decision makings, but I think it's been worth it in the end.
Yeah, and like you say, really interesting that the people are so attracted to reliable, trusted brands like the BBC. So how do you make the decision when you're talking about running into the fire? Who advises you on how close you should go to patients? How close? How, what sort of setup do you have? Maybe shine a light a bit.
Yeah, so we had a situation right at the start where our Asia editor, who's based in Beijing, she had already been dealing with this. Should we go to Wuhan? Should we not? We sent a team to Wuhan. All of those protocols we talked about. We had a WhatsApp group where we talked about our experiences. We went through safety risk, the high safety risk team. So we talked about exactly how it was going to work. The problem is in other countries, there was lockdowns. There still are lockdowns. I'm seeing, huge boom mics. Here, there didn't seem to be that level of concern. I was standing here and saying to the doctor, well, you need to stand there. He's like, oh, it's fine, it's fine. I'm thinking, what? So we had to sometimes direct medics, staff here. And I had to direct my team to say, no, I know he wants to go closer, but don't let him. So these are the kind of decision making. It's one thing to have the high risk team here. They've advised me. I've got to keep that in my head when we're going into hospitals or we're going into an ICU, which we did. But I've also got to look at the situation on the ground, which is why are they telling me that it's okay? These doctors are telling me okay. So I think we've learned lots of lessons along the way. I had to be tested. I came back from Daegu, got a little cough. And obviously we had drive-throughs here. It was done in 5 minutes. But we did make sure that the team protected themselves. My biggest concern was that we didn't, even if we did get infected, didn't infect other people. Yeah,
really interesting. Thank you. Now, Mindy, you've been responsible for very much the social media output of Bloomberg's coverage of this. And obviously we have more than 130 offices. So maybe tell us a bit about how you've been approaching the pandemic.
Well, I mean, our biggest attribute and the strongest hand I have to deal is our 2,700 journalists in 120 countries. To be able to pick up the phone and reach out to a reporter, an editor, a bureau chief in one of those 120 countries is incredibly valuable to us. It's one of the things that I think that really differentiates us. We have the ability to be able to, as countries and cities start going online, to reach out to them and say, pick up your phone, because people are still consuming with this on a regular daily basis in droves. So to go out and just hold it up and just walk around, show us what it's like as non-essential businesses start coming online. What does that look like? What does that feel like? We had something as simple as a reporter yesterday in Berlin get his first haircut in 2 months. Now, this is not groundbreaking reporting, but it's showing what it's like for life to slowly start creeping back. And people are embracing that, because not only are they remembering what it's like to go out and do things as simple as getting a haircut, but we're also showing them, is it safe? What do you have to do? Do you have to have a mask? What does the social distancing look like? We did that we did something similar to that for one of the oldest malls in Chile that just opened over the weekend. And it was very, very specific on how they were going to be handling social distancing. And we had a reporter who said, would you like me to go down there and I can take some video and I can take some pictures and show you what that's like? It's something that we've really leaned into to continue to show that firsthand accounting. But to your point, we have to make sure that we have very strict rules and parameters in there so that, we want to bring that reporting, but we also want to make sure that our people are safe.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mindy. Now, with all this news and information coming in, Ishan, how do you determine what you're going to write your column about? Tell us a bit about your process, please.
Sure. I mean, if I could just jump in a bit earlier to join the rest of the conversation about how we've kind of structured our coverage. It's been really quite fascinating sitting here in Washington. I used to be based in Hong Kong almost a decade ago at this point. But my colleagues at the Washington Post were covering the pandemic. The outbreak in China as early as everybody else. We at the Foreign Desk sort of launched a live blog that was doing daily updates, hourly updates by late January, early February. And it was, it was a full court press. There was a lot of attention in terms of traffic and readers being interested. But if you turned on the television in the United States, in early February, late January, there was not a hint of what was happening, because the U.S. was in the grips of this whole imbroglio with impeachment. And I think one of the many surreal that whole episode that was such, so that sucked up so much oxygen in Washington is going to become a kind of rather surreal historical footnote of this pandemic. About what compared to what my colleagues here on this panel have had to go through, my life is much easier. I'm just doing what I normally do, just from my kitchen instead of my office. But absolutely, in terms of where I think my column fits, it's in drawing those comparisons. It's in quickly showing exactly how South Korea can offer certain lessons to the United States, also showing how the United States could never emulate what South Korea did. It's in recognizing the political tendencies of certain types of leadership styles, and the ways in which the pandemic is triggering non-health risks to democracies and republics elsewhere. And so it's in trying to stitch together a sense of where we're going in this incredibly unprecedented time. Obviously, there are moments when you just want to sit back and really just not say anything, because there's such a tremendous daily churn, and absolutely, I'm not a science reporter, and there are many days in which I just wish I could just sit back and let a science reporter take over my column. But I think there are obvious ways in which you can be responsible and careful in the suppositions and in the subtext of what you're putting forward, and instead focus it on what I do, which is sort of the political dimensions of what's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. And now, as our minds turn to recovery, and we think about what sort of things we should be measuring and how progress should be measured, what are the metrics? Ari, I know you are a science reporter, and you've been dedicated solely to COVID-19 since the start of the year. Maybe tell us a bit about your where you're at right now in terms of what is important, what should we be measuring?
Right. I mean, I think our primary responsibility as journalists is to contextualize this current moment for the public. Obviously, we won't know where we are in history in the moment, but to provide some sort of educated guess about where we are in the trajectory of this pandemic. So that means, are our lockdowns successful, and are they successful enough to prevent, the situation from having to repeat itself all over again with a complete second wave? Are we actually reducing cases? I think one of the things to point out, and Ishan, maybe you found this as well, is that when we're comparing regions or countries with one another, we often fall into this trap of creating this false equivalence that if one region simply did what another region did, or if one state simply did what another state did, that they would have contained their outbreak. And I think as a science reporter, I've always been very careful to present the data side by side and to not draw those false equivalences, because we have so many confounding factors right now that can influence how an outbreak actually manifests within a population. So that's really important for me, but also just to make sure that people understand where we are in history, or at least guess as to where we are.
Yeah, and Alan, you talked about the imperfect data earlier. I mean, how do you determine when enough information is enough? And even if you're working at speed and in real time and you're getting different data points, maybe tell us a bit about your processes there.
Yeah, I mean it's a moving challenge all the time. I mean, if you look at the one of the products that we've made is a coronavirus tracker to try and allow people to make some kind of international comparisons and some sort of sense of what's happening with the pandemic. That has been a rolling product which we've had to update from the back end. The sheer amount of effort that my colleagues have put in just trying to get hold of consistent, sustainable data sources that we can wrestle into that comparable format has been a tremendous effort. So although people might look at some of these things and look at the outputs, which is the stories that are written and the graphics that are produced and so on, it's actually the sort of under the bonnet assessment of different types of data sources and how much you can rely on them and how much you can actually use them to make comparisons or not, That's been a huge part of our work on this story, and I mean, I'm sure Aria will feel the same, that has changed week after week after week, right? As people react to the crisis. Now, in the UK, for example, the Official Statistics Agency has done a great job of bringing out previously sort of new data on COVID cases and deaths that previously we wouldn't have been able to get hold of, and they've been responding to the pandemic in a really positive way in terms of putting information out there. But of course, that's going to be different in every country across the world. And so we are still playing this game of sort of catch up. And there is going to be an element of this where we end up looking back at it in the sort of rear view mirror to really try and get a complete sense of what we've been looking at. The other thing, of course, trying to keep that, I mean, the thing that no one's complaining that they haven't received enough information during this crisis. There's been so much information, so much data. And I think the thing that's also been really, really important is for people to have reliable ways of that being collated. Now, we've been trying to do some of that where we've seen gaps and opportunities to do that, but we've also been working with a number of different data sources, different partners who have really made similar efforts themselves. And one of the obvious ones is the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University, who've been trying to really, they've had a team of, I think, over 100 people around the world who've been trying to capture the state of the different lockdowns in different countries, because again, that's something that's changing on a daily basis. And it's incredibly important because, you know, before you can exit a lockdown, you need to know sort of how strict has it been, what elements of it can you relax, and that is so country specific that's an incredible thing to try and keep on top of. And as we start to exit lockdowns, the thing that's really interesting is you finally get this sense of the difficult decisions that have to be made in terms of the trade-off between protecting people's health and protecting, you know, the economy of the country that you happen to be in. And that's why when we look at things like the lockdowns and are they successful, I think it's really difficult in some senses, because I think Ishan used the word unprecedented a moment ago, and you know that's a word that we've used a lot this last few months, because normally
everyone's using it too much. Can I say? Yeah, well, but I'm making a point of not using it. But go on.
But I think there's a valid reason for that, though, because so often when you try and work out the clue to what's going to happen in the future, you look to the past. That's kind of how you do it. You say, right, let's look at what's happened before, and then that will provide where do you look to right now, right? Like it is unprecedented. And I think certainly from the Financial Times' perspective, I think there's a broader point beyond just that of my team, which is, you know, it's the job of our newspaper to explain the connected world to people, right? Like that's basically what we're trying to do. And this is the first time ever that basically an entire global shutdown has allowed you to see how things are connected to other things. And when we talk about supply chains, we talk about the economy, we talk about health, you realize those things are all so interconnected. And so that's why this feels like such a moment in terms of, the history that the sort of Aria referenced. And that's what makes it, it's a crisis, but it's a crisis from which we'll learn a great deal, I have no doubt.
Yeah, it's interesting. And obviously, as different countries come out of lockdowns at different times, that we are looking for lessons that can be learned from those who have gone before us. And Laura, I presume that's why there's such an interest still in South Korea. And also, we don't know, are we measuring like for like? When we talk about new infection rates in Asia, is it the same as they're talking about in Germany and so on? And so, Laura, maybe tell us a little bit about your experience and whether you feel like it's like for like.
I think part of the problem is it is not like for like. It's very difficult to kind of say, well, what's worked here in South Korea will work in the UK, will work in the United States. And part of that is because they were ready for it here. They took it seriously right from the word go. They got their first case in January the 20th and went, okay, we need a test. They had a test and 100 labs ready to process them within 2 weeks. That is a phenomenally fast response. When you compare that to other countries, only now in the UK are they looking at mass testing as a way of getting out of lockdown. So there was never any need to get to that lockdown stage. So it's very difficult to look at South Korea and say, okay, this has worked, because they didn't let the virus get away from them. And I think in terms of comparing like for like, Well, part of the problem is, when I tell people that just over 250 people have died here, only one of which had no underlying conditions, people kind of raise eyebrows. There isn't enough data. We're still early on, and the scientists here are still telling me that there isn't enough data to compare like with like. You can't even compare death figures in many respects, because in the UK, for instance, they haven't really counted those in care homes. So you aren't looking at like for like. But what you are looking at is, if you are ready for a pandemic, this is what you can do. If you are coming out of lockdown, these are measures that might work. But here in South Korea, it's come at a cost of privacy. There have been leaks of data, names, occupations of those who've been diagnosed with COVID-19. So there is a give and take. There are grey areas, but here public health is valued over privacy. Is that the same for the likes of the UK and the US? It's hard to say.
Yeah, really interesting. Adrian, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think everyone's absolutely right. It's really hard to compare country to country, and South Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore moved very quickly and very early and have faced various kind of second wave scares. Singapore, which seemed to be very ahead of the curve and its ability to get things under control, left out migrant dormitories and has faced now its own kind of second wave of infections. I think what's interesting is going to be seeing coming out of it what lessons the US and UK and Italy learn from places like South Korea and Hong Kong, where you're seeing, if you can't come here unless you have a Hong Kong ID and you're a resident, and even then you get tested the moment you get off a plane. You face 2 weeks in quarantine. I, as an American citizen, can travel to the US and go about my life based on whatever rules are in there. I don't face quarantine. And so, it'll be interesting seeing as the US comes out of it, as the UK comes out of it, do they look to South Korea, to some of those lessons? You can go to a restaurant here, but you get your temperature checked, you get hand sanitizer at your table. The tables are spaced out 1.5 meters. They hand you a nice little bag to put your face mask in. I mean, everything is sort of, there's an infrastructure and a culture and, social customs and norms that have built in. I mean, in South Korea, they call it everyday life quarantine, which, it's just built in. The social distancing and the restrictions are built into the way life is operating now. And, if the US and the UK and other places that are still kind of trying to get the outbreak under control were to pay attention, I think that would be, something they could get ahead of and try to learn lessons from, is what we're doing now to ease back into life without a treatment and without a vaccine.
Yeah, it's interesting. We should credit Taiwan as well, who I know have also done an incredible job of containing it. Mindy, have you got any thoughts on the sort of regional differences?
It's so interesting, everything that I've been hearing, because sure, we can look at the Asia Pacific region as a leader and as a barometer of what it's going to be like as we start going back, businesses start going back online. But the United States is so different. And, a lot of the norms that are very every day throughout, Asia Pacific, Hong Kong specifically, they're just not embraced in the United States. And you see that with everybody protesting. You see that happening in Michigan. I know in Oklahoma over the weekend, they said that they were dialing back on requiring masks if you were going into stores, because literally, people were coming in and they were threatening store workers with violence. And when they were being asked to put on their masks, you had, in New York, we're coming out of spring. We've had a lot of really cold, dreary days. This past weekend in New York, it was a really nice, our first back-to-back warm kind of early summer days. And you just saw everybody kind of emerging from their homes out in droves. And there was not a lot of social distancing in Central Park. You just saw clumps of people, some wearing masks, some not wearing masks. Governor Cuomo has come out. He's been very transparent on how he's approaching this. He's been very clear about, you need to wear a mask. It's not for you, it's for others. You're putting others in danger. But people are just, especially in the United States, they're so protective of their rights. And they don't like it when government comes in and tells them, I can't do something. If I don't want to wear a mask, I don't want to wear a mask.
Yeah,
it's going to be very interesting to see how this happens in the United States, because we have a tendency to not follow other global norms.
Yeah, really interesting point. And Ishan, this is obviously exactly this dissonance and disconnect with the US is exactly fodder for you, isn't it, right now?
Absolutely. It's and of course it's very difficult to compare countries and societies and norms and legal structures, and all those things are very different country to country. But I think the examples of elsewhere on various fronts have enabled us in the United States to see the extent to which the US was already, to use a term of art that we've learned during this pandemic, immunocompromised, in the sense that, as Mindy was saying, there is this kind of very troubling polarization, distrust of mainstream media, to the extent that people don't necessarily listen to or follow the coverage of the New York Times or the Washington Post, or they see the coverage of the New York Times and Washington Post and assume that there's some sort of agenda there when we are citing officials who tell them to wear masks or sort of really adhere to strict social distancing. It's also been fascinating, just in terms of the reader feedback I've been getting, when I've written about some of the stimulus measures and support bills pushed through in Europe, about guaranteeing wages, some of the things that already exist in Europe, like sort of a national unemployment insurance that's much more effective and substantive than what exists here in the United States. And when you're seeing this absurd record unemployment in a matter of weeks here, 30 to 40 million people without applying for benefits in less than a month, that tells a lot of people in this country, and not just Democrats, but on both sides of the aisle, people are waking up to sort of some of the real systemic issues here. And that's in part because they've seen how other countries are managing it better and have the capacity to manage it better and take care of their citizens more quickly. And then I think the real kind of troubling thing is, especially as we are in an election year, and we have a president who seems more fixated on the election than on necessarily addressing the pandemic in ways that are consensus driven, if I can use that term. You've seen very different types of leadership elsewhere. The speeches of Angela Merkel are getting circulated around the United States just because it feels like you're watching an alien from another planet. And I think recognizing the global differences is important, but also deeply important and helpful to when thinking about how we're all coming out of this together.
Yeah, thank you. And that leads us nicely on to thinking about the short-term and mid-term future. What does it look like? What do we expect to see happening over the coming months? And how will you guys be adapting accordingly? And that's an open question. I don't know if anyone's got a burning desire to go first on that. Adrienne, well, okay. Sorry, Laura.
So in terms of, we just went back to the office on Monday for the first time in a month and a half. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about and thinking for our US colleagues, how do we go back to the office at this point? We've gone back to about half the staff in the office, allowing people to work remotely if they want to continue working remotely, to come in later if they want to avoid commute times. We're sort of building in social distancing into the office practices. So I spent a lot of time thinking about just like, what does the future look like from a work perspective? I think we've all gotten used to Google Hangouts and Zoom calls and, trying to figure out how to find a human interaction, both professionally and personally, while still virtual. And so we're incorporating, I think, a lot of those lessons learned into how we do things going forward. You go into our elevator in our office and there's hand sanitizers and tissues right there. We have, disinfectant, cleanings 3 or 4 times a day. And so we're really just trying to figure out, until the world changes, until we have a treatment, until we have a vaccine, how do we keep everyone safe? I mean, at this point, none of us know when we're going to be able to travel again to any extent. How do we as foreign correspondents, cover the world when you can't move between countries? We're not set up to cover every country. Our Southeast Asia correspondent covers 10 countries. How do we cover that in a place where you actually can't move when flights are banned? And so learning to kind of report, learning to work in that world while keeping everybody safe is sort of the next 6 months to the year of our life at this point.
Yeah, Laura, sorry.
I think aside from the work concerns, obviously we are now back in the office here, but only just. The temperature checks that were taking place in our office regularly have just stopped. Schools have not gone back here yet. They go back in a couple of weeks. So that gives you an indication that even once you've crushed the curve, it takes some time to get back to normality, even though there hasn't been a lockdown here. I think in terms of, to give you an idea of what it's like here right now, health officials every day, we get a briefing every day. They're not slapping themselves on the back and going, well done, South Korea. They are continually warning the public. They are telling them that it is inevitable, they say, that there will be a second wave of this pandemic in South Korea. So they're preparing. And actually, one of the plans is they'll have enough tests to test the entire country, which will be 55 million tests, which blows my mind. But these are the kind of preparations in terms of behind the scenes, away from work. These are the kind of preparations that they are making here. So even though they've crushed the curve, the work does not stop. And everyone here wears a mask. There's still an element of social distancing. There's still an element of care, even though, hundreds of thousands have gone on holiday during this, what is the kind of golden week here in Asia of holiday week. But I think it's worth pointing out that if things are like that still here, you can imagine another few months, especially in the likes of the United States, the United Kingdom, and in Europe. That's the kind of life that you need to expect. And if they're warning us here to get ready for a second wave, then I'm pretty sure the scientists elsewhere are going to be talking and thinking the same.
Yeah, right. And as we track everyone coming out of these lockdowns, how do you deal with conflicting information? In the same way as you've dealt with conflicting views throughout the crisis. Mindy, I don't know, do you have, how do you decide how much weighting you give stories, you give experts? Do you always make sure there's a balance? Maybe just talk us through it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem, pandemic or no pandemic, that journalists face all the time. Fake news is not a new thing. It's a hashtag these days. So, it's our responsibility as journalists. It's the whole reason why we went in here, to try to go through the reporting. There's a reason why it's called reporting, and doing what you need to do and speaking to the correct number of sources and check and double check. And the other thing is, there are lots of surveys these days. There's no shortage of information, but you have to do the digging. Where did it come from? What is the source? What is the reputation? Is it a reputable source? One of the things that I say to my team all the time is, I'd rather be late, last, and right than first and wrong, because that's where our value lies. And I don't want us people won't trust us. They won't come back to us. Why would they? If we continue to get things wrong, why would they want to listen to us and read anything that we have to say, or watch any of our videos, or listen to any of our reporting? So we have to be, very stringent, and also very measured on how we check and double check and source.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I wonder if sort of non-journalists realise that the significance of that statement you just said, because obviously in the digital age, the rush to break news and to be first is always there. And there are benefits to be had. If you're first and Google search puts you first, you do get more organic traffic. But sometimes in some situations, it's better to be right than to be first. Ari, I don't know if you've got any thoughts you want to add.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at Insider, the fact that we are a digital only publication and we started out as a digital publication has really served us well here. We were uniquely positioned to work virtually, but we also understood the digital landscape of constantly updating stories to make sure we had the most accurate information in a climate where the data is always changing, even the scientific understanding is changing. And we've monitored stories that do get a lot of traffic. So we understand that if people are clicking on that, they need the latest information on that story, and that's absolutely the first priority. So I think in a way, the digital landscape has really worked to serve the public to make sure that they're getting the latest scientific information, and we're not a paper of record. So we will go ahead and update something if a scientist has amended his statement or her statement, or if a new piece of information comes out that shifts the narrative. And we've really, I think, we really benefited from that strategy.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Just hearing the processes you all have in place. I mean, how frustrating is it then to learn poll after poll, find that trust in journalism is at an all-time low? It just doesn't seem to stack up. I don't know what your thoughts are on it, and if there's anything else you can do to help mitigate this growing misperception.
I mean, I think it's quite simple. There's just sorry to chime in, but I think, a dedication to the truth, is always going to serve us. And whether or not people see our information as leaning in a certain way or another, I mean, as a science reporter, the facts are always quite clear. So, scientists really want to disseminate the information to the public, and they're not trying to put a spin on anything. And obviously we'll source multiple scientists, but making sure that we're acting in service of the truth at all times, I think, is most important.
Yeah, but I guess scientists have fallen out and disagreed with one another throughout this crisis. Ishan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Could I just chime in very quickly?
Yeah, sure.
We've got a long list of really interesting questions from our listeners, so perhaps we could just turn.
Yeah, I was going to come to it in 2 minutes' time, to leave 10 minutes for that, if that's okay, Alex. But thanks for the reminder. Yeah, Ishan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, our boss, our editor-in-chief, Marty Barron, always keeps it very simple. Just instructs us just to do our jobs, and as Arya said, that is reporting as rigorously and fairly and as possible. That's offering no shortcuts to the truth. In some cases, when you're doing digital journalism, you can also show your work. And I obviously, in my column / newsletter, am constantly offering substantiating evidence and links. The thing is that what's so concerning about this moment is that just simply doing our jobs, though, is not enough to change that perception, right? And I don't know if we're equipped on our own to redress all these concerns about trust in journalism beyond just because we can say we're doing our job, and I think we're doing a great job, but we are existing in a political context where what we do has been weaponized in the discourse in ways that we can't particularly control. And when I talk about polarization, unfortunately, when you talk about polarization, it assumes a kind of symmetry. But I don't think, especially in the United States, that we're living in a symmetrical moment. Well, we are in some sort of the right-wing bubble of the media, Breitbart's, the Fox News, etc. There is no analog to that on the left, and we certainly don't think we represent any kind of analog to that. And so it is a very frustrating circumstance to be in. The one thing I'd say about these polls showing lack of trust in journalists is that usually we do better than most politicians. So that's the optimistic thing.
This is true, and estate agents as well. I think sometimes we manage to be. Right, okay, let's have a look at some of these questions. Some of them I can tell straight away are quite long. I don't know if we're going to have time to really do the answers justice, but here's one here from Daniel Bending from BBC Global News. What impacts are you facing in publisher cutbacks and staff furloughs amid an increase in demand for news reporting?
Well, I can tell you at Bloomberg, fortunately, we are in a position where we have not had to do staff cutbacks. So for us, we're still, business as usual, full force. And so, you know, that's been very wonderful for us as journalists to not have to worry about that.
And anyone else, any thoughts? Sorry, Adrian.
Yeah, I'd jump in on that. I mean, we've been, you know, we positioned ourselves a number of years ago to focus on subscriptions, and have been, you know, which is very helpful in an environment where advertising has dropped off a cliff for everyone. And so that's really put us in a position of strength. And at this moment, I mean, I would say, you know, that, you know, going back to the last question you had, like, we've actually seen more interest in our journalism than ever before. And I think the pandemic has actually kind of reinforced the importance of on-the-ground reporting, of trusted sources, and people are coming back 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day to read and consume and devour everything we have. And that's true, I think, for any number of organizations, the Washington Post, BBC, and Bloomberg, and that you're really seeing, you know, just hunger for trusted news sources that are trying to present the most important information without bias, and without, you know, trying to set, without a point of view in terms of left or the right, and really just presenting information. So we've been very, very lucky to be able to actually invest and hire and continue to, you know, kind of put core resources into journalism. Now, that's not true for everyone, and obviously a lot of our local peers are struggling, and I think that's going to be something that's really, you know, in the coming year and years, will be problematic for the industry, is the loss of local journalism.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, sure. And Alan, I know the FT has experienced sort of triple-digit spikes in audience since this pandemic began.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd agree 100% with everything Adrian said there. You know, like, I think this is definitely a time that the news industry is going to reflect on its business models, and I think particularly for local news, that's an issue. I mean, for us at the FT, it's certainly reaffirmed the wisdom of going to a subscriptions-focused model a number of years ago, because it's stood us in great. It put us in a great position as far as this crisis is concerned. The one thing that's come along with as well is just completely new levels of engagement with our readers, right? Like that's been amazing to see. So the page, the coronavirus tracker that we published is now the most viewed FT story ever by some way. And as part of
what kind of figures are we talking about there, Alan? Give us a ballpark.
Well, it's many million page views higher than the previous.
Many million, okay.
Right, so I mean, it's considerably higher than any previous story we've published. But one of the things you realise when you're doing that is that the engagement and kind of genuine feedback loop that creates is enormous. So we created a dedicated email address for feedback from readers from specifically that page, which has given us some of the best user testing and kind of engagement with readers that we've had. So there are real opportunities, actually, for scrutinizing what you do. And I do think, actually, just as a general point here, one of the things that, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and these extreme working environments that we've been operating in have generated new ways of working that I think will actually last beyond, you know, the eventual lifting of lockdowns, because there are just new ways of doing things that probably we wouldn't have got around to doing under more comfortable times, let's say.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. We've got so many questions. Let me try and get a few more. Jamie Walters is the editor of What's New in Publishing. Some of you may know. He's tuning in from Spain, and he says one concern here in Spain is the increasing censorship of the media, with the issue being raised in the EU Parliament. The concern not only in Spain is that this crisis will lead to greater censorship. And this is obviously, when we think about China and the journalists being expelled from China as well. What are your thoughts on that? I think who's best to answer? Maybe Adrienne, maybe you're best to answer this.
Sure. I mean, I think what you've seen broadly across the you know, obviously we were caught up in a tit for tat diplomatic, as was the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, where we had a number of our reporters expelled after a State Department move. But I think you're seeing it broadly. I mean, you're seeing a number of authoritarian regimes really using the pandemic in a lot of ways as cover to push through, to clamp down on the press, to clamp down on opponents, to clamp down on, protests or other dissenters. And I think that's absolutely a concern, because they're playing in a lot of ways to the fear of people, this idea that, they have to take aggressive moves, they have to move quickly to do things, and through that are able to get public support or push things through without people even noticing. And so I think certainly, for us in China, but we're seeing a lot of that in other places as well.
Yeah, sure. And I guess as international media brands in multi-markets, I guess there's a strength which comes in that as well. Now, quickly moving to Alan Levy, who from Starcom Media Agency, who says, quite incendiary comment, should the world blame China for not alerting the WHO earlier and seek reparations which may threaten a longer economic recovery? Or should we just forgive and forget? I don't know if anyone wants to wade into that.
I think as journalists, we have to remain impartial in every way, especially as the BBC. I think, that's one for scientists, that's one for world leaders to decide which stance they take. I think as journalists, we have to kind of look at where this virus has come from, try to look and find the truth of where this virus may have come from, and deal with the issues in front of us and what might be stretching out for the next 18 months. And I think certainly one of the reasons why people come to trusted brands is because we are impartial. We can look at the for and against for a question, but it's not for one, I don't think, for journalists to answer.
And I would just quickly add that that question poses a kind of false binary as well. I think you can scrutinize what China did and fault it for various reasons, while also not using that as an excuse for the failings of other governments and systems elsewhere, which is what this argument for reparations is ultimately about. And I think we shouldn't get sucked into that kind of false binary.
Any other thoughts on that before I move to one final question? One from Nick Manning, who's the founder of Encyclomedia International. He says, misinformation is leading to civil unrest and violence, and it could spiral further. So should social media rein in the conspiracy theory mongers? And if so, how? So, I mean, I guess he's talking about the social media platforms here specifically. So Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, do they need editors, I guess is the question. I guess it's interesting from your point of view, your trusted global media brands, you use those social media platforms, but you absolutely manage your own feeds. Maybe whoever wants to take that first.
My Twitter feed has become a monster every day. I am updating, what the KCDC, the Korean Center for Disease Control, and I'm very aware that people are watching my feed, and how many are now watching my feed, and how many are quick to comment on it. When it comes to Twitter and Facebook, that's a decision for them, but I'm also very aware about what I'm sharing. And I think when it comes to misinformation here, it can obviously kill people. If it comes to whatever they decide to take or what they don't decide to take, that's when perhaps it's time for editors to step in and go, look, we need to tell people the truth in the same way that trusted media brands do.
That's great. Any other thoughts? We have run out of time, but I just want to say on behalf of the more than 300 people who are still tuned in, thank you so much for making the time today. We know how busy your schedules are. It's a really important and timely topic. And Alex, back to you.
Well, it's 2:00, so nothing more to say from me apart from Ara, thank you for chairing so brilliantly. Thank you to our panelists. We will be following up with some more information on the session on the website later. So thank you very much for tuning in, and see you on June the 3rd. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thanks, guys.